Welcome to the Sasquatch Outpost podcast, and I'm your host, Jim Myers, and excited to be with you this evening. And thank you, Patricia, right off the bat for a super sticker. We really appreciate that. And I'm excited to see some of you who are in this evening. Patricia, Stephanie's going to be helping me with moderating, as she has done for a couple of weeks now. So thank you, Steph. Doug, Coho, good to see you again. And Miss Kitty. So thanks you guys for tuning in. It really means a lot to me that you're here and that you want to be a part of what we're doing tonight. Please do subscribe. If you haven't subscribed already to the podcast, please do so. And comment and hit thumbs up if you enjoy the podcast. That helps our ratings, helps move us up a little bit each week in the podcast ratings, and we are very grateful for that. So, as I mentioned last week, that I was going to go backpacking. I did. I don't think I'd mentioned that 2 months ago I injured my knee skiing. I tore my posterior cruciate ligament, and so I hadn't done any backpacking, any significant hiking since then. So I decided, okay, this is my time to try it out, see how my knee would do. So my pack was pretty heavy, probably too heavy, but it was a 3-night trip. So I had to have quite a bit of food, and it was cold. So I needed some extra warm clothing. And so my buddy Jason had gone ahead, and he had picked a campsite maybe 2 miles in. We were off of the Goose Creek Trail in Lost Creek Wilderness, if anyone knows where that is. Anyway, I hiked in, and I'm looking for Jason, and I see a guy camped over with a fire, and he's sitting by the fire. He's got his hoodie on, and so it was really windy. It was really getting cold, and it was very windy. So I go down there by the creek, and I'm trying to figure out if this is Jason or not. And he finally looks up, and he kind of gives me a cursory wave, which if he knew who I was, he would never do that. So I thought, it must not be Jason. So I keep hiking, and I go maybe another half a mile up the trail, and I'm yelling, and there's nowhere to camp up there. So I come back down. I'm standing up on the trail above where he's camped, and I'm yelling at the top of my lungs. And there's just too much wind. He can't hear me. And at the time, I'm thinking, I don't know who that is down there, but what a jerk. He's not even acknowledging me. I'm yelling, who is that? And so I turn around and I hike a mile up the trail. And there's nowhere for him to camp. So I finally come back and figured out it was him. And we set my tent up before it got dark. But anyway, that first night, it was really, really cold, really windy. Windy was blowing 50 miles an hour at least. You could hardly keep the fire going because it's blowing so hard, and it's, just blowing your sparks everywhere. So we went to bed, 9:30 or something. And that night, he had something poke into his tent in the middle of the night and then walk around the side and was playing with his rainfly. And then another buddy, Clint, arrived the next day with his son, Elijah, and they set up their campsite. And they have a teepee tent that is nylon. It's got a wood stove in the middle. It's a real lightweight wood stove with a pipe going out the top. I was envious because they were warm and I wasn't. But anyway, in the middle of the night, 1:10 a.m., I was going to show a video, but I couldn't get it set up in time for tonight. But 1:10 a.m., Clint's lying with his back against the tent, and he's lying on his side. And something comes and kind of shoves him from the outside and kind of pushed him almost onto his back. And he yelled, and he actually knocked over his wood stove. And thankfully, it had gone out already, so there was no fire in the tent. But we got up the next morning, and we're telling stories. And and his son, with all that, with him yelling and knocking over the stove, his son never woke up. He's lying right there next to him. So I thought, wow, he is a sound sleeper. So, but it was a fun weekend, and my knee did okay. Had a few aches and pains, but it was fine. And for those who have not tuned in before, most of you probably have, but my wife and I own the Sasquatch Outpost in Bailey, Colorado, and the Sasquatch Encounter Discovery Museum. And we're expanding the museum, building a new movie room that's going to be a cave. And I'm getting close to getting done with that. So if you live in Colorado, in the Denver area, and want to come up and check it out, give me another couple of weeks and I should be done with that. And it should be a lot of fun, can fit a lot more people. And we'll figure out what to show on the video. So, well, I don't want to take too much time talking myself because I'm really excited to have my guest tonight. This is my first time to have Dr. Jeff Meldrum. And Dr. Meldrum is a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. He teaches human gross anatomy and graduate level health, professions programs, and researches the evolution of hominin bipedalism. He also researches the possible persistence of relic hominoids, i.e. Sasquatch or others. He's the author of Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, and he edits the online journal, The Relic Hominoid Inquiry. So, Steph, you can bring Dr. Meldrum in, and can you? Here he goes. There we are. Hey, Dr. Meldrum. Thanks for being with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
You bet. This is a real pleasure for me. I honestly look at you as one of the statesmen of Sasquatch research in the country, and so it's an honor to have you on.
My pleasure, indeed.
I've followed you for years, and to have you on the show is a real pleasure and a treat. And I know many of our listeners were excited that you were going to be on tonight, and especially to have our topic for tonight, which is a very unique topic. Actually, Dr. Meldrum and I were going to do this interview on my very first show on Valentine's Day, and we couldn't connect correctly before the day. So this is Valentine's 2, if you want to look at it that way. But yeah, I've always been intrigued by your career, Dr. Meldrum, and I wanted to ask you. You're one of the few academics who openly is willing to talk about their Sasquatch research and the things, your theories about them. How has that gone with the university? Was that ever an issue for them?
Well, it depends on who you ask and what level. I mean, the university is a large and diverse community, and so amongst my peers within my own department, it was literally kind of split 50-50 when it came to votes for promotion, tenure, and so forth. It was an issue that literally split the department in two. There were vocal antagonists in other departments across campus, and as well as supporters. And then a lot of people, to their credit, who are just too busy doing their job and occupied with their own business to really be really concerned about it. And at the administration level, it was either tolerant or positive. I mean, one of our previous university presidents would occasionally drop me a postcard after and something like, "Jeff, I saw you on the History Channel last night. You did a great job. Good work. Represent the university in a positive way." So so that's the case. I haven't had the opportunity to interact with our current that was 2 presidents ago, and so I haven't had the opportunity to directly interact with our current president, so I don't know what his feelings are on the topic. So
Because you're very prominent in the media,
mhm.
and I've seen you on many different programs and documentaries. A lot of them talking about your expertise on footprints and footprint and
Right.
development and how did you get into that side of things with Sasquatch?
Well, as you pointed out in the introduction, my research, if you will, my orthodox research training and emphasis has been in the evolution of hominin bipedalism. That is, the specializations, the adaptations that we exhibit uh, associated with our unusual habit of walking on 2 legs,
Mhm.
feet, bipedalism. And part and parcel with that research program is the examination of fossilized hominin footprints, beginning back with the Laetoli hominid tracks from East Africa that date back more than 3.5 million years ago, and are the first direct record of an early human ancestor, a hominin, walking on 2 legs. And so that aspect, that dimension, the adaptations of the feet and the lower extremity to the habit of bipedalism was really quite central. So when the opportunity presented itself to examine footprints attributed to Sasquatch, possible evidence of an example of another bipedal primate, what a fascinating opportunity to compare and contrast our own condition. And
Mhm.
that's how the nexus occurred, how I became pulled into this from a professional perspective. I mean, I've long harbored an interest in the topic from the time I was a youngster growing up in the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, it's by far the most prolific body of data that we have. Something is leaving those footprints. It's interesting
Yeah.
when you other scientists um, who have sort of tested the waters or looked into this topic. People like John Napier, for example, um, who was one of the first scientists to actually write a serious treatment of the book or of the subject in a book, professional in his professional capacity. He was an anatomist. He was also a physician. His expertise was in primate locomotion, and so and particularly human walking. And so
Mhm.
it's interesting that it's that evidence that is so compelling in those few instances where scientists have taken the subject very seriously and
Yeah.
even stepped out into the public eye, pursuing that interest. It has been that body of data that has driven that curiosity.
Well, I know people, researchers and others all over the country will send you photos and
Right.
tracks to look at. How many plaster casts do you currently have in your collection?
I don't have an exact count, but it's well over 300, and
Okay.
that I've accumulated, and that of late, largely in due to the good graces of Cliff Barrickman, who, because of the notoriety achieved through finding Bigfoot and
Mhm.
the vehicle of the the regular town hall meetings, he became something of a lightning rod, and he's been astute student of the science of footprints as well, and
Yes.
so yeah, we compare notes a lot, and try to exchange materials. He's been very gracious in contributing in that way. Um, it's not a competition to see who can accumulate the
Sure.
most.
Sure.
But when you have that extensive of a data set, it is a remarkable testament to the inherent consistency, the rational basis of the adaptations of the foot of this giant biped. These are not simply enlarged facsimiles of a human foot.
Right.
They, the distinctions of a foot derived from a more primitive architecture, doesn't show the derived longitudinal arch expression that is so characteristic of the human condition. And there are other distinctions, the mobility of a flat flexible foot, and the longer relative toe length, the enlarged and elongated heel segment, and so on and so on.
Yeah, the reason I asked, I knew you had in the hundreds of casts, but the reason I asked that is because I often get people making comments, accusatory comments, that there's not really a lot of research out there, that we are not doing research. Why don't we have more data? Well, there is data. There's a lot of data out there. If people would care to do a little research on their own, they would find yourself, Cliff, others, many researchers around the country. The things we have in our museum is all data, far more than most people would ever imagine, that's out there about Sasquatch.
Oh, absolutely.
And weren't you involved with the Skookum cast as well?
I was invited to come and examine the cast. I mean, I was involved in the analysis that followed up on the discovery. I wasn't a participant in the activities that led to the initial discovery. But I got this phone call from Derek Randalls that he had something really exciting, and hopped on a plane and flew out to Seattle and had a look at it, as well as Dr. Grover Krantz was there. I think John Green was there at that time, and it was. It's an impressive. The problem is, it's rather obtuse, meaning that without considerable anatomical familiarity and experience with animal sign. And sometimes, a little knowledge is dangerous. There were many people who immediately poo-pooed it as nothing more than an elk wallow, that it just it could be explained away as an elk. And of course, that was one of the first questions we asked from our position. And I took a large photographic print of a photo of the cast down to our local zoo, which is limited to endemic species. It's not an collection. And we have a big paddock with elk and bison and pronghorn. And I visited with the keepers right off the bat and showed them this, and we went out into the enclosure and looked at various imprints in mud and dust and so forth. And there were some superficial similarities, but the devil was in the details. And for anyone who clings to that simple explanation, that simplistic, I should say, rather than simplistic explanation, the question, the fundamental question is, where's the footprints? Where are the hoof prints, rather? And yes, there are some hoof prints in the vicinity, but they have no association with the imprint. An elk lying on its side, as it has been proposed, which does bear some rough similarities in certain points, that elk has to get its feet under its center of gravity in order to stand up. They can't levitate. They can't just float up into the air and then place their feet under them later. There are no prints associated with that maneuver. So in the absence of that, the alternative is quite reasonable. The thing that really convinced me, that literally shattered any doubt that I had of whether this was an elk imprint or not, was when I just went blank on his name. This is terrible as I'm getting older.
Hey, let me pause. Let me ask you to pause just for a second. I just had a text for some reason we're not broadcasting live on YouTube. Let me see if we can figure this out.
Yeah.
We should be. I'm not sure. Hold on. I'm just sorry about this. Let me just see.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, we are back. I apologize about that. That was, let me bring Dr. Meldrum back in. Apparently, YouTube blocked all of our broadcasts this week, and I did not realize that. So we're trying to work that out with YouTube. So we're on Facebook currently. So sorry about that, Dr. Meldrum.
Oh, it's all right. No apology necessary.
We were talking about the Skookum cast, but I want to since there was a break here, I want to move into our topic for this evening of Sasquatch sexuality.
Sure.
Stephanie, hopefully our listeners can tune back in, can go back to Facebook and refresh for this new broadcast. So if not, they'll catch it on the podcast later. So let me just reload these slides. That's quickly done. So here's some of Dr. Meldrum's books. The best known, in my opinion, is Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. And this is a second edition, is that right?
No, this is just the cover of the audio edition.
Oh, the audio, okay.
Right. And I would just point out that I know that there are circumstances where an audio book is preferred and is convenient, but bear in mind that the actual print book has about 150 figures, which do not transfer over to the audio version. So you miss out on that if you go with the audio version. But it's great to do while you're driving or whatever, jogging.
Yeah, there's a lot of information in that book. And then we sell the book. We don't currently sell the audio, but we also sell the Sasquatch Field Guide, the middle one, which is a great, simple resource for just identifying Sasquatch, just general information about Sasquatch. And people often ask us for something just like this. So I appreciate that you created it.
Right.
And then Sasquatch Expedition, was that an earlier?
No, that's just simply a little notebook, a little spiral-bound notebook that has a few snippets from the field guide. And I would point out too that so people don't get confused, that the publisher was inclined to refresh the artwork, and so this is the same field guide that has had several cover art iterations. This being the latest. But so don't let that confuse you. There is another field guide that addresses more broadly relic hominoids around the world, compare Sasquatch to other potential persistent species. But the expedition notebook is just that. It has some tidbits and some sort of template data sheets, and then lots of room to essentially function as a field journal where you can record your observations and experiences. So,
which is a great tool. I've thought of doing something like that myself, but that's a little ways down the road. I have another book that I would probably create before that. But now you have to tell me on these slides if these are starting in the correct order.
Well, it's fine. I didn't necessarily. I just wanted to offer a few things to maybe support some of our conversation, but we can certainly take these as they come and talk about the significances and let the conversation flow from there. This one is one of several that tries to represent in a very schematic fashion what the social structure. If we're going to talk about sexuality, it behooves us to have somewhat of an understanding of, or at least a discussion of, the possible social structure of the species within which those encounters take place. And of course, we have just clues. We don't have a lot of systematic observation to rely upon. But for example, we know that most sightings and most footprint finds are of solitary individuals. So if we look for analogs, for comparisons amongst the known great apes, the most likely comparison would be to something like an orangutan, which is rather solitary in its behaviors. So what you have there is the representation with the male symbol of a dominant male who essentially advertises his presence and occupies a given range, a home range, a certain amount of real estate, a piece of real estate, which happens to overlap those of the females with their offspring in tow, as indicated by the smaller symbols there. This is different than the more gregarious primates or apes rather, like the chimps and gorillas. Gorillas have a single male involved, but that male, instead of being concerned about the real estate, he monopolizes control over a harem of females, has exclusive access to them. Chimpanzees, the common chimp and the bonobo, have sort of multi-male, multi-female patterns as well. So our attention kind of zeroes in on the orangutan and this term noyu, which describes or is defined as a male whose territory is that of a female. Now, when it comes to the sexuality, in this case, the females, as is the case with most of the non-human great apes, the females are only give birth at fairly widely spaced intervals. Orangutans especially will go, anywhere from 4 to 7 years between childbirth.
Oh, I had no idea it was that long.
Yeah. And so they seek out, when they are receptive, when they're, in heat, so to speak, or ovulating, they then seek out the male, the resident male, who's the biggest, baddest guy on the block, and by virtue of that status, presumably has good genes. Basically, they'll provide a good contribution to a successful offspring.
So are gorillas and chimpanzees that infrequent as well in their?
Not quite as much. I mean, it varies, and it varies upon how extensive. I shouldn't say how reliable, but how extensive the data collected for the various from observations are. But they are fairly widely interspersed. Humans are kind of unusual in that they are capable almost immediately afterward of impregnation again. I mean, if the mother is lactating and nursing the offspring, that has a tendency to suppress ovulation in most, unless there's excessive body fat, which fools the body into thinking there's plenty of resources. So let's knock out, not to be crude, but
let's go for another one. Yeah.
Let's add to the family while the resources are plentiful, basically, when there's a good chance of survival. But, in most situations, sort of pre-industrial situations, that caloric drain of lactating and nursing the offspring would keep the body fat low and would suppress ovulation.
That's interesting. I didn't know that about body fat, but that makes sense that the body would think it has more resources available if the woman was heavier, so that could be fooled into thinking you can go ahead and have another offspring.
Exactly, and it's a commonly known, female athletes that elite athletes that reduce their body fat percentage to a very low level often become amenorrheic. Their period will stop. So they no longer go to their body no longer makes the effort to produce a fertile egg, because the prospects of being able to support that gestation, that pregnancy, are interpreted as being low due to the very lean body fat condition.
Now, our understanding of Sasquatch mating habits would be anecdotal at best, obviously, but I know of many reports of people who have seen family groups with an adult male and female, and one or more young. What would be your guess as to how often they might have young? Or
Right. Well, again, we can only rely on those few anecdotes, and honestly, I'm sure you've got good sources. I'm not that familiar with reports of family units, nuclear family units. I mean, the one that often comes to mind that is often cited is the Ostman experience, where he
yes,
was unceremoniously toted back to the parent home base, and there seemed to be ma, pa, and two young'uns.
yeah,
But this is interesting, because if you stop and think about the circumstances leading up to that situation, the male was considerable distance away from the female and
yes.
presumed offspring. I mean,
When he picked him up, yeah,
he was interacting with Osman for several nights in succession before he toted him all night long, as Osman described it. So, conceivably, he was 10, 20, 30 miles away from the female with her offspring. And then even once there, the description of their activities would suggest that they were rather independent of one another. They often
Hmm.
left the little valley separately and came back with different resources or whatever. They interacted with Osman very separately. So one can wonder if it's not unlike this diagram that we've got up here,
Yeah,
where that male has a temporary kind of consort relationship with the female and her offspring, and maybe she's from the description of the young ones, they were juvenile to young adult. Maybe it was that time again, and he was trying to impress her by
yeah, yeah,
chocolates and flowers. They brought her Osman in a sleeping bag. Who
yeah.
knows?
But they didn't harm him from his
No,
story.
no, no.
And I do
I
know
think
of I've heard of several habituation contexts where, in those contexts, and you have to decide if you trust the person recounting these stories, but
right.
they were there was an adult male, there was an adult female that seemed apparently to be together for a very long time, and
Yeah,
then a number of offspring. Um,
yeah,
but my assumption would be, and I'm curious to know what you would think. My assumption would be when they have an offspring, that they must mature more quickly than our offspring do.
I think you're probably right in that assumption, and we can really only speculate and draw
Right.
analogy and to the great apes. And whenever there is a situation, I mean, the thing that selects for the protracted development, the extended period of development of human offspring is what? The large brain size.
Hmm.
It's that postnatal continuation of the brain growth, into the first couple of years that pushes all the developmental landmarks further
Hmm.
downstream. Everything indicates that Sasquatch has a brain, on par with those of the other known great apes, or perhaps a little more like an early hominin, like the Australopithecines. So,
Right.
an increase of maybe 10, 15%, but nothing to indicate, despite the persuasions and opinions of some people, that these are some sort of forest people. They're just a different kind of human. The evidence doesn't indicate that, doesn't support that notion. If they are highly intelligent, on par with, or in some fashion comparable to human, then it's a different kind of intelligence, because they've
Hmm.
adapted to the natural world in a completely different way. So
Yeah.
David says that they're people and not apes. Well, again, what is it about them that justifies that conclusion?
Sure.
About their anatomy and behavior much more readily is accommodated by comparisons to the known great apes. One of the great treatises on this is Dr. John Bindernagel's book, where he does an excellent job of navigating the natural history literature of the great apes, and comparison after comparison that prompts him to conclude this is North America's great ape, the Sasquatch. Now, this is an interesting slide, and it points to ways in which we can look for correlations between the patterns that we're drawing analogy to and the resulting anatomy. So in this case, we've got the example of the bonobo. Now, the bonobo has a matriarchal system where closely related females are essentially running the show. They're calling the shots. The males associate themselves, but they don't have exclusive access to females when they come into
the females make those decisions in bonobos, right?
Well, yeah. Ultimately, well, and the females are very non-exclusive.
Yeah. This is not a monogamous situation.
Exactly. So what's the strategy that's employed there? Well, it's an arms race, and whoever wins the arms race is more likely to be successful in fathering the offspring of the next generation. So the arms race manifests itself in ever increasing size of the testes, where the missiles, the ICBMs are located. And so
I mean, that's a phenomenal picture. I have never known that there was so much similarity in size.
Yeah, I mean, there's the two testes completely outweigh the brain, and here you see this male bonobo, showing off. So the question is, a simple question can be posed: Have any reliable witnesses ever observed a Sasquatch endowed like this bonobo?
No, great question.
I've never heard.
I've heard of people who have observed their penis, but I've never heard of anyone talking about the size of the testes.
So that would also support the conjecture or the speculation at this point that they probably have a system that's more like the orangutan, since the male orangutan has exclusive access because by virtue of his real estate holdings. He doesn't need a huge arsenal of ICBMs or a very impressive delivery system. And so the male genitalia of the orangutan is really inconspicuous and innocuous.
Compared to these, obviously.
Compared to these. And the gorilla as well, for the reason that they have access exclusively to their harem that is associated or is adherent to them. I think there's a picture, if you advance one, if it got put in there. Well, here's another perspective. Again, in this diagram, I've got pictures of the common chimpanzee, and the common chimpanzee has a patriarchal system, often more male patriarchal. Sometimes there's a coalition between closely related males that then monopolize access to the females. Chimpanzees, the common chimps, also have rather large testes, but help with the timing so that the dominant males can really ride herd on their females. The females display their proximity to ovulation, this sexual swelling, this
so one on the left is the female.
Both of those are females. Yeah,
okay.
So the skin around the vulva becomes extremely engorged with fluid. It becomes very tumescent, very red, and that displays their receptivity. So again, we can ask the question: has any reliable witness of Sasquatch ever described this kind of anatomy? Well, no, I'm not aware of a single one. So we can kind of rule out again that type of strategy where access in these very social that have apes that have a lot of contact within the group, where the male then can better monopolize access by the female very clearly exhibiting her ovulation.
Yeah. Let's see. I can't remember what this next one is.
Oh, so another way, another anatomical feature that's correlated with social structure and sexual strategy is the degree of sexual dimorphism. So our orangutan example, which has the Noyu, the male monopolizing or having defense of a large territory, does so by virtue of keeping other males at bay by his immense size. And so here we have a male and a female with offspring orangutan exhibiting this extreme in sexual dimorphism, in difference of body mass. The male can be up to from 2 to 3 times the size of a female, and that's where, and we see the same sort of thing to almost the same degree again in gorillas. But then in the chimps, the bonobos and the common chimps, the difference between males and females is much less extreme. They don't need to, they don't fight off their competitors. They monopolize access in different ways.
Yeah, I know that gorillas and chimps, gorillas especially, I've seen a lot of documentaries about their fighting against a potential competitor, maybe from their group or from outside their group. Do orangutans do the same thing with other male orangutans?
Absolutely. Yeah, the young adult males are forced out of their natal area where the dominant male is resident, and they have to bide their time on the periphery until they put on enough bulk, enough strength and maturity in order to either displace a male or to attract away from a resident male some of the females that are in that territory.
Now, there's from eyewitness accounts, there are stories of the male Sasquatch, adult male Sasquatch, being larger than females, not by this level of dimorphism, but certainly being larger, having more musculature.
Sure. Broader shoulders,
right.
Upper body strength.
More comparable to humans, maybe a little bit.
Well, but I think even more than humans. If you go, I think there's another slide in there somewhere, if it's included, that has the footprints.
I think there is, yeah. Let me go up and I can come back.
Right there. There we go. So here's a case where on the right, we've got a footprint of Patty from the Patterson film, which, if taken for the time being, and I'm absolutely convinced it's the real deal, that represents a female. And that female probably stood between 6.5 and 7 feet tall and weighed in excess of 700 pounds. The footprint on the left is one of a number of examples of this individual that were also discovered in that same region around Bluff Creek during this time period. In fact, we have examples of his footprints. I think it's a big male, given the greater size and especially the greater breadth. The females tend to have a more gracile, more slender profile, as you can see there. And the males, because of their much greater mass, I would estimate this male at 1,200 pounds, roughly. And these are, admittedly, these are estimates. These are, spitballed for the sake of conversation. But there's no question that is much bigger individual than the
Yes.
one right. We can agree
Are
on that.
those in proportionate size, correct there?
Yes, yes. So those are represented to scale. Patty's footprint is 14.5 to 15 inches, and the other footprint is 16 to 17 inches in length.
Okay.
So you
Yeah,
can
that's a
see.
huge difference. Huge
Yeah.
difference.
So there's a degree of sexual dimorphism that falls, it's not as extreme as in the gorilla or the chimp, or I'm sorry, or the orang, but it's certainly greater than the chimp and greater than actually than human
Yeah.
sexual dimorphism.
Hmm. Now there was a comment a little earlier that made reference to the DNA study. I'm assuming they're talking about the Ketchum study. What is your opinion of that in relationship to what we're talking about?
Totally unreliable.
Okay, why would you say that?
It's just because I know her dealings. I've interacted with her. I know the story behind her study. I know her interaction with providers of some of the tissues, her interaction with Justin Schmea, who himself is a hoaxer as well. It's just totally unreliable. And the science is non-science. It's nonsense. The best treatment, the best review of that whole project is Dr. Haskell Hart's book, which is published, or if you'd like to just read something that he has published that's open access, if you go to the Relict Hominoid Inquiry, my online journal, there's a paper summarizing all of the shortcomings and problems with not only her data collection but analysis, especially the analysis. I mean, it's nonsensical. She at one point included a minimum spanning tree of her samples, and the closest specimen was a Galago. This is a prosimian primate. And in defense of that result, she came out and says, well, we just discovered that there were actually these subfossil lemurs on Madagascar as recently as 10,000 years ago that were these giant lemurs. And the unfortunately, the interviewer didn't have the wherewithal to then really ask the penetrating question. But the question, so what? You're suggesting her thesis was that Sasquatch was spawned as the result of a hybridization event between a human female and so far as to date it to Northern Europe some 35,000 years ago. And now she's suggesting, and she said early on, she said, and some non-human or subhuman species, unknown species. And then from that hybridization came the Sasquatch. I mean, first of all, it reflects a total lack of understanding about the way in which speciation occurs. Anyway, but the point is what she's suggesting that a Paleolithic or Neolithic female of Northern Europe somehow hooked up with a giant lemur from Madagascar, and that little tryst resulted in Sasquatch found in North America. I mean, give me a break. It's just anyway.
So I'm curious because my understanding of the study that some of the labs, because these were independent laboratories that did the analysis, not her lab but the other labs, and the result of the mitochondrial versus the nuclear DNA, one being human, one being unknown. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's been, that was the thesis, that the female human provided the mitochondrial DNA, and that's how mitochondrial DNA is passed to the next generation. It's entirely maternal. Those mitochondria are within the egg. The sperm contributes the chromosomes, the chromatin from that spermatid, but not any of the cellular organelles like the mitochondria. So the child, the offspring, has just maternal mitochondria. And this has been an interesting, has presented an interesting kind of a quandary, and not a quandary. One of the things that we've run into repeatedly when DNA has presumably been extracted from a sample is that when a cursory study is conducted looking at mitochondrial genes, which is the typical approach for a preliminary analysis, it has come back as human. And one of two conclusions is offered. Either it was contaminated through mishandling by the investigator, or it was simply a human hair, for example, or a human tissue sample that was misidentified as attributable to the Sasquatch. The third possibility that I've often drawn attention to is that in a comparison with a closely affiliated species like this, that may only differ from human sequence by 0.5% or 1/4, that you've got to sequence enough DNA in order to assure that you have given or that there is a chance that you find those rare markers scattered throughout the genome. And so doing a partial of one gene locus is probably not going to be enough to make a compelling case either way in that regard. So now there's interesting fourth possibility, and again I'll refer your listeners to the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. There's a paper by Harder, Dr. Harder, who explored a very interesting possibility called mitochondrial introgression. And the most fascinating aspect of his paper for me was the fact that he could actually point to examples in the literature of modern species today where this phenomenon has been demonstrated. And it basically, the phenomenon is that that as the result of very rare hybridization events, the mitochondrial genome gets introduced into the, let's call it, the colonized population, and through what we call the lucky lineage, just the stochastic luck of the draw, it spreads to the point where the phenotypic features of the hybrids become diluted through the back crossing, but the integrity of the maternal contribution of mitochondria persists. So if you were to go into that if this were scenario where a Sasquatch in a human population, and the human contribution is the female mitochondria that gets introgressed into the Sasquatch population, then if you went and you looked at a sample from that Sasquatch population where the introgression has been extensive, chances are when you test the mitochondrial DNA, you identify it as human, because it is human. It is human. It's been introgressed into the population. So that presents a really interesting possibility, which means that any serious DNA study in the future is going to have to include or be based upon nuclear DNA sequences.
Right.
Because
what did the nuclear show? My remembrance was that the nuclear DNA was unknown, didn't appear in the database. Was that the case for some samples?
Well, my recollection was, and one of the first criticisms that I listened to, which was a very fair review by some curious students and professors of molecular biology, is that they found that what she had was a hodgepodge. It was a hodgepodge of samples that reflected a variety of things, including raccoons and possums and other woodland creatures. so that the samples that she was using were a mixture of DNA.
Hmm.
So
to your knowledge, are you aware of any what you would consider a legitimate uh, genome
no,
study of a Sasquatch sample?
no. At this point, it's just been uh, it's been nothing that could differentiate the sample from a human. All the mitochondrial analyses that have been done, no one has been able to produce a
Hmm.
novel sequence differentiated by distinct markers. And I don't, other than the Ketchum study, I really don't know of anyone who has done or has claimed to have done extensive
Right.
nuclear
Yeah,
sequence.
I am not either. Let me back up here. I think I skipped a slide. I
Yeah.
want to see if it's something you wanted to talk about.
Well, this was just looking at the degree of sexual dimorphism, the difference between
Okay.
male and female, and then there's a subsequent one where then an estimate, what sample of one pair, just
Let's
to
see if I got that one.
make a data point. Well, here I just showed. People might ask, well, 700 pounds. How did you come up with that? The
Yeah.
most direct way to estimate body mass is by determining the volume, if possible. And so this is based on measurements that were made by John Green from tracings from the original Patterson-Gimlin film, presumably with even greater clarity and demarcation of the outline and so forth, with an estimated height of 6'8", and then rendering the body as a series of cylinders. Once we do that, we can estimate the volume, and we know the density of composite tissue of a body, typically. Now, there's going to be, again, some variance, obviously, depending on how robust the skeleton, what the body fat percentage is, et cetera, et cetera. But we come out, again, spitballing. We're well in the ballpark. I'm comfortable with the estimate of in excess of 700 pounds, coming in between 6.5 and 7 feet in height. And then, so the next slide, I think, was showing
Let's see.
that same bar graph, but with the Sasquatch.
This one or
No, go one more. I think if you. No, I guess it didn't get loaded up. There was just one more that had a bar for Sasquatch, and it
okay.
felt sort of intermediate between humans and the more solitary or the solitary orangutan with its extreme body dimorphism. So the point is, I mean, again, we're talking, these are all hypotheticals.
Sure.
Hypotheticals are based on several discrete clues or data points, and but what we find is that there is remarkable correlation. There is there are just consistencies between both the anatomy and the reported behavior as exemplified from observation or from trace evidence in the form of footprints that all paints quite a remarkably coherent and consistent picture. Even if we go to something like the vocalizations,
Mm-hmm.
an animal that is relatively solitary and is advertising its presence in a home range or is trying to attract females to it, like the orangutan. The orangutan is notorious for its loud call. It has this
Mm-hmm.
loud, booming call that carries through the forest. Well, what do we have as far as reported vocalizations for Sasquatch? Well, it's quite a span, but one of the most prominent things is these loud, booming calls, possibly even incorporating infrasound,
Right.
suggested by those who have experienced them up close, where they feel the resonance within their chest. They see their
Mm-hmm.
legs vibrating from the low frequency sound waves that are penetrating. The high pitched wailing, banshee like calls. I mean, these are the types of vocalizations that animals that are dispersed use to indicate their presence and or to space themselves, to remain dispersed for another. So
Well,
again,
and we obviously don't know what their calls mean. We don't know.
Right.
We're guessing. But backing up just for a second on the size of Patty, which I'm very comfortable with your conclusions, and obviously we know this has been a highly criticized piece of videography,
sure.
and people have claimed even till today to be the one who was in that suit, quote unquote suit.
Yeah.
And to me, that was an impossibility for a number of reasons. One, just being her height, which was established by markers, if I'm correct, markers of that terrain where she was walking that were enabled them to determine by triangulation how tall she actually was. Is that correct?
Well, there were several different approaches, and from just holding a Jacob's pole, a surveying pole. Peter Byrne did an analysis. John Green and Jim McLaren tried to do some cinematography using a comparable camera and lens with Jim McLaren, who's 6'5", walking alongside the footprints that were still very clearly evident in that very angular grit that made up that sandbar, which held the shape of the footprints for months afterwards. So he could follow that line, and you do, and there's several that are available online. I did one of my own because I wasn't satisfied with the potential error in the superimposition, but you can. It clearly shows that whatever this was, it was bigger than Jim McLaren, who actually, with a fairly stooped posture anyway. So there've been a number of different studies. The most recent one, I'll just point out, because Expedition Sasquatch just, I think that's the right title, the one with Maria Mayo and team, Russell A. Cord and so forth. They did a LiDAR. I'm sorry. They did a LiDAR scan of the scene, and there are some issues. There's some problems. They were very definitive in their conclusion that the subject was a mere 6'3" tall. And although they didn't say it, there was this quite implicit but overt implication that, that lessened the credibility of the Patterson-Gimlin film, because it would be easy to find someone 6'3" to stand in the suit.
Sure.
Again,
But the suit would not have her proportions, unfortunately. So,
well, that's just it. Yeah, an off-the-shelf suit wouldn't have the breadth. I mean, her shoulders, you can see there, they're huge by comparison. I mean, I'm just right at about 6 foot. I have rather broad shoulders for my stature, and my shoulders are only about 24, 26 inches across. Not 36 inches across the shoulder. And she's straight up and down. I mean, her pelvis and torso, and she's as deep from front to back as she is from side to side.
Well, and I think we would both agree. I mean, I'm convinced of the reality of this being a Sasquatch as well, but and I for the life of me, I can't imagine why someone would persist with a myth until today that they were in that suit. But there just wasn't technology in 1967. There scarcely is even today to build a suit that could do what that creature did.
Oh yeah. So, exactly. I mean, it's you can't help but point to the remarkable coincidence that Chambers was busy in Hollywood creating all these Planet of the Apes costumes, and used that as, I mean, that was the cutting edge. That was the pioneer in costume creature effects, prosthetics, and makeup. and suits, what they could afford to do, I guess you'd say, short of going animation or even animatronics. And so if someone was able to do that, why weren't they employed by Hollywood at this time when there was such a fascinating whole industry as a result of the popularity of the Planet of the Apes franchise?
Well, and if Hollywood with their budget could not create the suit, how in the world will a couple of cowboys have a budget to create a suit like that? I mean, it's just to me, it's ludicrous. But
yeah, and I've researched this as much as anyone, and I've talked about it time and time again. The approach that I like to take at this point from a scientific perspective is there are things that are portrayed. I mean, even if you had someone that had the technological wherewithal to pull off such a costume, the features, the anatomical features of the costume are counterintuitive with what the prevailing ideas in anthropology were in 1967. And there's a whole list, from the fact that you've got this thing which from the waist up looks essentially like an ape, but from the waist down has the buttock, the lower limbs, the proportions of a much more human-like figure, and so on, down a whole litany of combination of traits: the flat face, the lack of projecting canines in the absence of tools, and so on and so on and so on. What you see on the film, dated in 1967, anticipates what we now know in anthropology to be conventional wisdom 10, 20, 30, even 50 years later. But how would anyone in 67, give him one lucky guess, but a dozen different unusual combinations of traits which were counterintuitive at that time, and yet anticipated our current understanding? Yeah, I mean that for me just blows it out of the water.
Well, and it would have been a suit that looked like a gorilla. They would have built a suit that looked like a gorilla because that's all that we understood.
Sure, it would have been a King Kong. Yeah,
King Kong. Sure. So let me show. I think there's one other slide which I combined two slides to make this one slide.
There we go. Yeah. Well, and then the other aspect about because I didn't know how far down with different behaviors we were going to go, but obviously the intelligence, and this comes back to the notion of, are they forest people, or are they some sort of primitive hominin or bipedal ape? And if you look at the presumed proportions of the cranium, you see something that's remarkably consistent with an early hominin, like this robust Australopithecine, Paranthropus boisei, from East Africa. And you can see that the facial proportions, in concert with the cranial proportions, the brain case, are remarkably consistent with a creature that has the brain that's essentially on par, just a little bit, like I said, about 10% bigger proportionately than that of a gorilla or chimpanzee. Nothing like a human. If we scaled it up so that the faces are relatively similar from brow to chin, then the human brain is dramatically large in proportion. So again, that's consistent with what we see. We don't see tool use, except for the opportunistic brandishing of sticks or the knocking of stones or those types of things, which are absolutely consistent with the same sorts of behaviors that are observed for and documented for the non-great apes.
So let me see what time is. It's hard for me to gauge our time because we had this long break.
Yeah.
So I think we'll try to bring this to a close. I'm curious. This wasn't on my list of questions, but one of the things that intriguing is Yeah. Is there language in terms of we've heard what appears to be, and I'm sure you're aware of Scott Nelson's analysis of the
I am.
of the brain part.
Sierra
Sierra
sounds.
sounds.
Sierra
Sierra
sounds recordings. Mhm.
And we've heard similar sounds here of it sounds like language, which includes clicks and pops and other sounds that you might hear in some of the African languages. But what are your thoughts on the language issue with Sasquatch?
Well, I've always been fascinated with the Sierra Sounds recordings, and I know Ron very well personally, and have spent time with him at conferences, and haven't had the privilege of being in the field with him, except our trip to Russia as mutual guests of Igor Bortsev. Um, and so, I like him and respect him, and I don't mean to cast dispersions, but I've always harbored reservations about the whole thing because, again, for me, the corroboration comes in the form of footprints, and unfortunately, the footprints that have been produced, documented, cast, and photographed at the Sierra site don't hold up to muster.
Hmm.
They're very problematic. They are
In terms of size, or
well, no, in terms of anatomy,
okay,
like they look reminiscent of swim fins. The toes show no asymmetry. They're just arranged across the end of the foot. You don't know if you're looking at a right or a left.
okay,
Uh, and so I've had some discussions with Ron about that. He's provided some photographs and so on, and provided some additional insights, but I still have some issues when it comes to the interpretation of the recordings. In the vein of Scott Nelson, who I also know and like and interact with very positively and so forth, and respect his credentials as a cryptolinguist and so forth. But I've had extreme frustration because Scott has been unwilling to submit his analyses, complete and write up his analyses and submit them relic hominoid inquiry for peer review. I'm just chomping at the bit, have been for years, subject those to some outside independent scrutiny, some second opinions, and to get the dialogue going, get a
sure,
conversation going.
yeah,
I am not convinced, I have to say, personally, from my own assessment of his analysis, that what he is, his whatever the proper term is, translation, transliteration of the vocalizations, are justified. I cannot imagine a creature, especially a rather solitary creature with the limited interaction with humans that they presumably have, picking up English, for example, and then rehearsing. I mean, repeating in a parroting fashion is one thing, but to incorporate English words in a meaningful way, creating a pidgin English, that just doesn't make any sense to me. And I often wondered, because I've interacted with indigenous people, with Native Americans who assert that these creatures communicate with them in their native language. And sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous whether there's a mind speak,
right, or if it's verbal,
to borrow that term, or if there's actual. Some of them have said quite clearly that there's an audible spoken language exchange. What was really telling was when Scott described in one of his presentations sharing his findings with a colleague, a fellow cryptolinguist who was Japanese. The Japanese cryptolinguist immediately recognized Japanese phonemes and words, homologs. And So, boom, there's your answer. Japanese ear hears the similarities to spoken Japanese. The Shoshone hears spoken similarities to Shoshone, and Scott is picking up on Pidgin English. But it's usually remarkably simple things like food,
Yeah.
one consonant, one syllable, one consonant, and one vowel, basically. And his list of phonemes is remarkably simplistic, in my opinion. They are sounds more than they are words, in my very amateurish interpretation. Acknowledging his expertise.
Sure.
But these are the questions that have to be addressed. So I
Yeah.
just want him to submit a manuscript and get the review process going and clarify and explore the implications of that.
Yeah, he certainly has the qualifications to create a paper that could be reviewed. And
but it's just like with the tool use, you go back to the brain size again, and then we have the further corroboration of the distinction of the hand morphology as exemplified in the few handprints we have. We don't have a hand that has the anatomy for precision grip for tool use, but for grabbing a stick or grabbing a rock, then that power grip, sure. But so that's consistent. That small brain size is also consistent with the lack of a articulate language that we see in non-human primates as well. So, there's some room there. Does the upright posture of the Sasquatch, has that brought about some changes in the larynx and pharynx that in human evolution was essential to the development? I mean, it's not just the plumbing. You've got to have the hardwiring, the hardware up there as well. There has to be the centers of the brain developed for the motor control and the cognitive aspects of producing and interpreting, hearing and interpreting language.
Absolutely.
It's the whole package.
Yeah, the whole package. Well, the question that was just put up about your opinion of the Melba Ketchum study, we talked about that earlier in our conversation this evening. So I encourage you to go back and listen to. I'm going to try to put up the first section we did before we had to cut it, and then this section as well. So, but thank you very much. Obviously within the world of Sasquatch research, because it is an imprecise science to date, there's certainly room for us to disagree and respect one another. And I feel very strongly that you respect Ron, you respect Scott.
Oh yes,
I'm sure they reciprocate. So there's room for this until we have bodies that we can examine, until we have a captive Sasquatch or something of the nature that it's. Until that time, it's more anecdotal than anything. It's our own eyewitness accounts. It's our accounts of things. But again, it's all still quite subjective. And so,
absolutely. And if I could just interject,
yes, absolutely.
The motivation as I undertook, when I actually prepared this particular presentation, of which just little parcels, but I put together a presentation on behavioral ecology and these various aspects of the possible natural history of Sasquatch. It was with the intent of addressing a criticism that was raised by Dr. John Napier, in which he made a statement that this whole proposition, the suggestion of such a creature was just was unreasonable. It was a creature that was unsuited to life in the temperate forests of the Pacific West. And so what I wanted to do was to say, well, what do we know, and what can we infer and
from what we know? Yeah.
To address that question. is it reasonable to imagine even a creature that fits the profile that emerges from the various eyewitness accounts of this creature?
Mm-hmm.
And does it seem to be adapted to the habitat that it is reportedly occupying? And so it's not so much me trying to say, well, Sasquatch do this and Sasquatch look like that, but rather, where do the breadcrumbs lead us? What conclusions can we at least, or what speculations can we entertain at this point? And are those speculations reasonable within the context of a proposition of a giant bipedal primate occupying temperate forests of the Northern Hemisphere?
Well, and we all have breadcrumbs, and we have to follow them where they lead scientifically, even if it's not in a direction that we presuppose they'll go. So, but I agree with you that there needs to be a scientific approach to all of our research, so that we're not only having anecdotal evidence, that we're trying to have scientifically based evidence. And I appreciate your emphasis on that, Dr. Meldrum, very much. So thank you for bearing with me tonight with our weird podcast. And,
certainly. That was no problem.
Yeah. And I'm very, very honored to have had you on the show. And I look forward to when our paths will cross at one conference or another or somewhere else. But
good.
Thank you for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
For our listeners, we're going to be having Jason Frank next week. He's a personal friend and researcher here in Colorado. He's written a book called Harry's, and we'll be talking to him about some of his firsthand encounters and what his conclusions are from those. So thank you again. And this is the Sasquatch Outpost podcast signing off until next week.